Okay, we're going to do three things today. I'm going to go through this a little bit fast, but we'll post the slides online. There's some really great maps that you might be interested in. Peter is going to read a poem, which probably is a good way for us all to remember that, at least unless you truly are totally Native American, we're all immigrants. And then we're going to have a discussion about where the club's going. Membership our attendance has dwindled down, and it may be that it's not working out as well as it should. So let me take this quickly. So I got interested in this topic actually for a slide I'll show you in a couple of minutes. It turns out that the earliest way in which people moved around in this country were Indian paths. Wherever you go, there are Indian paths. If you happen to think about where we live now, the Wapo Indians were here. And one of the reasons they were here was because of the great obsidian that you could find up in Annandale Park. And that obsidian made its way, they can trace it with radioisotopes, and it made its way as far as 150 miles away. Okay. So these were the first paths. And throughout this, people traveled where there were roads and other people. So when you think about your own ancestors, you're thinking about why did they go where they went? And the answer is that's because there were ways to get there. Okay. And you sometimes wonder why that German family arrived at Ellis Island and then ended up in Ohio. And the answer was because there was really good transportation to Ohio, and there was already a German town there. Okay. People who spoke German and went to either a Lutheran or Catholic church. Okay. So this is the actual Great Indian Warpath and trading path on the East Coast. It's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it, but this is well documented that the Indians would use this to go back and forth, typically using river valleys. Okay. And we'll see this same pathway in a minute or two as well. So before 1800, the way you got around was water. You came by ocean. You went up a valley like the Hudson River or the Susquehanna or the James. Okay. The roads were essentially non-existent. You could take a horse like the Indians we saw at the beginning, but that was pretty much it. This was transportation. You'd have some place where a ship of some size could pull in, okay, and people would get on or take goods off. That's how all the work was done. I'm fascinated by this because this is the Fulton Ferry in 1750, which I think is really fun. So where's the ferry? Down at the bottom. This is the ferry. So that's the way you got across the river, East River, to go to Manhattan, what's now Manhattan. So there was the Indian pathway was replaced by the Great Valley Road. Okay, and my ancestors left Philadelphia, went down the Valley Road to Western North Carolina. Okay, they were Quakers, so you can follow them because they left one Quaker meeting group and showed up with another group. And as the Quakers do, you have to be permitted to leave and accepted when you get there, all of which was well documented. And this is all of the highways that were active before the revolution. I'm always fascinated because the one near Knoxville actually goes within about 100 yards of my daughter's house there. In thinking about how travel worked, after the French and Indian War, the British rewarded the Native Americans by setting what's called the Proclamation Line, which essentially was the Appalachian Mountains. And they instructed the colonists they were not to go west of that line because that was Indian territory. Well, if you know anything about American history or genealogy, you know full well that that didn't keep people from crossing that line. They they, they immigrated, set up their little houses over here. Another common thing was, of course, these roads. There were no bridges, so you had ferry boats. One of my sixth great grandfathers was a ferry boat operator on the New River in Virginia, and you can go and find the legislative law that set his rates for his crossing. Okay. Um, so as we move further into time, we're moving into Kentucky, and this is the Daniel Boone era. So what you've got now is the Cumberland, the road that cuts off from the to the Cumberland Gap and on into Kentucky and all the way to Louisville on the Ohio. So after the Revolution, one of the first things that they did was set up the Northwest Territory, which of course is a big part of how we moved west. And one way you can look at this, we'll see maps like this in a few minutes for other times. But in 1800, if you started in New York and had a week, you could get all the way down to Washington and Richmond. If you had 2 weeks, you could get into Ohio. You follow me? Long time. You want to go to what's now Chicago? 6 weeks. Speaking of Chicago, this is Chicago circa 1833. 350 people, little population down here. And this is Chicago in 20 years later in 1853. What's the big change? Steamboats. Steamboats began to take over the country, and particularly the Mississippi River. So in the first part of the 1800s, we had canals and steamships. We also had turnpikes. We'll talk in a minute about the National Road. And in thinking about these, you have to think about them in two ways. One is this is helping people move west, but it's also helping people move goods east. So as you do that, you're able to have farms that no longer are just set up for the household, enough goods so the household can live. But you began to have farms that could export goods. So this was what's called the National Road. It started in about 1806, finished 1830, went all the way from Baltimore through to St. Louis. Okay, and you wonder sometimes why towns are where they are, right? Well, the answer is they're where they are because that's where the damn road went. This is what, excuse me, this is what they built as a road. It's a real road. It had a base, okay, and you could take a wagon over it, for real. Then you had the Erie Canal, 1825. It opened the Great Lakes and made New York City the U.S. most important port. Then they invented the steamship. It was actually invented in Europe, Britain, but it was quickly adapted here. Going from Albany to New York was never a problem because you were going downriver. But going upriver, you literally took a sailboat that would have to tack back and forth with the wind to try to finally make its way up to Albany. With the steamship, You could do it in a day and a half. And then they immediately moved steamships over to the Mississippi. And they changed the Mississippi completely. So now, by 1830, okay, in a week, you could basically get almost anywhere on what we think of as the East Coast from New York. Okay. You're still talking 2.5 weeks to get to Chicago. Then the day of railroads came. First railroads came in 1830. And now the rates of travel just dramatically changed. You could go from New
This is
York.
fascinating.
Hello? Everybody online? Okay, you go from New York to anywhere on the Mississippi and west in a week. West Coast was still a problem. Okay, this 1857. These were all the roads that were in place, and then the railroads. So transcontinental 1800, 1840, think Lewis and Clark. You were not going to the west unless you were going around the Cape or Panama. 1840, 1869 took 4 to 6 months and cost a lot of money. By 1869, where we had the Transcontinental Railroad, took 7 days and was affordable. And has everybody been to see the train museum in Sacramento and seen one of these ships was there? One of these trains was there. So by 1887, rail dominated the country. And now, in 3 days, you could go from New York essentially to San Francisco. Okay, I'm not going to go through these because I want some time to talk. What I've got here is a summary for each period, and these slides will be on the website so that you're welcome to go through them. But the main point is when people came to this country, or when people moved from the east to the west, they were following the roads in almost all cases. Okay. So questions or thoughts on this topic? Oh, those are references that I have at the end. Okay. Okay. Most of these were funded by the government, federal government. Okay. As you may know, the history of the way that the Transcontinental Railroad was done, and many of those railroads, the funding was basically they would grant the person who wanted to build the company that wanted to build the railroad land along the railroad. So they had alternating sections, okay, whatever size section, I don't know, but they would own a lot of land along there, and that's how they would be repaid. It would not be an actual cash outlay. But the national road, the one that had that was paid for by the federal government. And now there would be offshoots of it that localities would pay for. Okay, so I mean, it's sort of obviously, if the road's going to go within 10 miles of your city, you're not going to be so dumb as to say, well, we're not going to connect to it. So, yeah. Yeah, National Roads follows I-70. I think that's probably correct. And the old Indian Warpath, for the most part, is Route 81. if you're familiar with Route 81. Okay. I mean, I'm sure it's different in some small places, but people basically just built up the road that was there. Why would they go some other way? No, Erie Canal was also federally and state funded. Okay. I'm hearing the answer is yes from someone who knows more than I do. Oh, uh, we're having a discussion here for anybody online about can you still take the Erie Canal? And the answer is yes. Okay, but I don't think they move any goods by the Erie Canal, and it's closed in the winter. When we lived in upstate New York for a while, and we lived in a place where if you looked at a map, it said there was an offshoot of the Erie Canal that went down to the town of Corning where we lived. And we went to the end of the road we lived on, and you could still see it. Amazing. Yes. There's a discussion here about something called the Buffalo Trace, which would have been in Southeast US. There are a couple of different traces in the Southeast. Trying to think of the one that goes through Mississippi. Does anybody, the Natchez Trace? Is that the one?
Yes, that's right.
That's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah, the Natchez Trace. That may follow one of those. There are a lot of Indian paths. I don't know. I think a trace is kind of like a southern name for a road, but and for those who missed that online, we were being referenced to a brandy named Buffalo Trace. Okay, any input from the folks online? Come on. There we go. Okay, Peter, I'm going to hold off on asking you to read your poem. I'd like to get into a discussion of whether or not we should have a genealogy club, and if so, what should it be doing? Um, for years, I've tended to treat this as like my private preserve. What I felt like talking about the next month became what we did. Um, I'm sure some of you know I'm slowing down. I kind of laugh a little bit at the idea that we have presidents who are younger than me, and I'm which is not unusual. I'm sure there are people in the audience who would share that note. But I'm definitely slowing down, and I'm not going to be able to maintain the pace I've done before. So, thoughts to share? Thought one was to do it quarterly. Okay. Okay. So the next thought, and I'm doing this for the online folks. Um, as a matter of fact, Peter, can you grab the other microphone up here? It's up on that. And if we have other comments, the thought was to have meetings to share what you have on your family tree yourself and something about your research. I would love to do that. Okay. I think that's an important way we can move forward is to do this as more of a sharing exercise. Okay. And the truth of the matter is, we can get a lot of knowledgeable commentary, okay, to share at that time. Good idea. Other thoughts? Anything online?
I really have appreciated the
wonderful information you've provided, and gosh, it's been really excellent. But I think having a deeper understanding of each person's process, in other words, what was just suggested, and any, I'm someone who's particularly engaged when there's emotional revelation of what particular events from one's study of one's ancestors bring up in one's own life. And so to include, some of the feelings that come up for me, it may not be everybody's cup of tea, would be more personable as well. So a combination of that.
Peter, I think you're talking more about what I would describe as a deep dive into individuals who had more complicated lives, as opposed to a tree, which tends to be more just, here's who begat whom and when they be, all of that.
Exactly.
And I think all of us have an appreciation for people in our ancestry who had a particularly difficult time or interesting time. I mean, anybody who essentially came from Eastern Europe to the United States during the Ellis Island period had a very interesting life. That has to have been, for most people, quite an event.
Yeah, I mean, the other aspect is that there are great many studies about intergenerational transmission of trauma. And I certainly see this among a lot of my clients and friends and family, my own children as well. And so I think we all have some aspect of personal experience that can help flavor just the factual tree and who did what when.
As long as we don't get into any deep psychological stuff, Peter.
All right.
We were just talking, my wife and I were just talking this morning about my mother and her family, who were very tight knit, except when they weren't. Okay.
Right.
And we're out of the same area of the country that J.D. Vance comes from, which is Western rural Kentucky, although he was born in Ohio. And I for real have a snake handler in my family. Okay.
See?
If everybody remembers what a snake handler is, my next door neighbor would have liked to have one last week when she was out on her deck and looked up. There was a thing crawling on the deck that had 5 rings. Okay. All right. Any other comments? Anyone online want to make a comment? Okay, Bob.
Why this has been so important to me is that I wanted to find out more about my grandmother, and we've talked about her in the past. And this club gives me the opportunity to do that. So it's important for me that the club keeps going. And if we did it on a quarterly basis, that's fine. And if I've learned more about my grandmother that I think that the folks in the club would enjoy hearing, I would love to share that. So the simple version is that I really want to see this thing keep going.
Okay.
Yeah, George, I've also particularly enjoyed the once a year when you would do the what's new online. In other words, the changes, the new things have been added, or the impact of AI, et cetera. And it seemed like an annual session on that was really valuable and helpful for me. I would certainly like to see that continue.
Well, I'm sort of hearing that maybe if we have an hour set aside and a half of that is set on a minor update I can do, and then the other half is set aside for people to talk about personal research activities, family, And I'm kind of in Peter's camp in the sense that I've always felt that genealogy is about telling the story, understanding the stories of people who we should know well. In my personal genealogy research now, I'm spending more time going back to my great grandparents' level and not back further, and building complete biographies of each of them. Okay. And it's difficult for us sometimes because, particularly for women, you get back 2 generations and you're talking, it was common for women to have potentially have a dozen kids. Okay. Which, at least in my family, would have been very different. Okay. Any other thoughts? Marty, can you grab the mic? Peter.
Oh, Marty.
Yeah, I just think that the general idea you have about half an hour devoted to new ideas for research and such, and then a half hour for someone to present their family tree and as Peter was suggesting, some of the interesting emotional and psychological stories. I think it's a good idea. But I think to be very helpful to someone like myself who's still doing a lot of the research would be in that second half to have the person talk about their sources. In other words, not just present the tree, but also talk about how they got the information that's on that tree. Where did they find this information? Was it Ancestry? Was it some other website that was most important? Did they go to source records, et cetera, et cetera?
That's a really good idea because I think, Bob, for example, for your situation, okay, understanding where you've looked and where you haven't looked, okay, and how to get at what so trying to understand different sources and different actions. I recently was doing work on one of my uncles and one of my wife's uncles who served in the Marines in the Pacific in World War II. Okay. And we're able to find their units and track the units to understand where they went. Okay. Needless to say, I never heard anything, nor did she ever heard anything from them. Okay. This was just what we were able to find. And knowing for good or bad that your uncle was actually on the beaches at Guadalcanal, okay, is kind of like, ooh. Okay, what else?
George, I agree entirely with you actually about, in my family tree, I can go back now to 1587. And I think about what am I really doing this for? How interested are my kids? And how can they get a sense of their ancestral roots? And they don't give a damn about someone in 1587 who might have been whatever. I have a ton of rabbis and stuff in my family, but they are much more attuned to, let's say, a circle around grandparents or great grandparents and anecdotal stories, which I can tell them, because it's those stories that have the juice and the interest. I have 9 hours of recording of my mother before she died. And that to me is a treasure. And I just want folks here to know that, do you have a grandchild or child or great grandchild that you want to tell your story to, or what you remember of your parents? So it has a liveliness and yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Well, in a similar vein, I think for all of us, there are a couple of moments in our genealogical history where things changed. Okay. The person who went from Poland to Massachusetts, you can go through the list of the changes. And Um, they're in many ways, yes, they are the most interesting, is trying to understand why did people do what they did. One of the reasons I was doing the transportation discussion was quite often I find people saying, well, I found my family in Missouri. How did they get to Missouri? Okay. And all it says is they're from, you know, and it's like the Pennsylvania to North Carolina. Okay. If you don't know the road was there, you'd think that's a really weird movement. Why would you go from Philadelphia down to Western North Carolina? And the answer was that's where the road went. And then there was still land down in North Carolina, although you weren't allowed to use it. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, if I might disagree a little bit on, I think some of the really old research is interesting too, depending on how you can tie it to history. I was able to find a vein in my family that was tied to the War of the Roses in the 14th century. And I actually went to a castle in Lancaster in England and found some of my family on the family shields. And to see, some of them were killed in the war, and it was very interesting to see how it tied to that time period.
Yeah, your older ones can be fun. Uh, my daughter's in her second marriage, and my stepsons were fascinated to learn that at one point their ancestors owned one Wall Street in New York. And then they moved before. That's the thing about a Dutch background. Okay. Let me take all that under advisement, and I appreciate your all being here. Peter, you want to wrap us up with your comment, your poem?
Thanks. Well, when I saw the topic, I was expecting something else. So this is a bit off topic, but I might as well read it anyway. A lot of Jewish people in Eastern Europe, they lived in shtetls and small communities, mud huts and mud floors, and they were forced to leave. The diaspora of Jewish people took place over 4,000 years. So just as background, I wanted to say that. And yeah, I feel very moved to pass on to my children the history that severed our roots from the Second World War forward. So I wrote I've written several poems, and I've also written a chapter in a book about this, but this poem is called Homeless. And there are a lot of metaphors in here. Long before I could walk, my parents ran away from home. They left behind our old family tree, deeply rooted in the soil that was nourished by our ancestors' bones. They followed the diaspora of thousands of years of rickety old carts piled high with the belongings of those who did not belong. Long before I could walk, I followed them on the legs that I inherited from my ancestors when I was born. No one held my hand. We ran even before those stars became visible in the light of day, even before boots beat in unison to the rhythmic thumping of soldiers marching. We ran pretending to not know our brothers and fathers who wore long black suits and beards and strange hats. They cast long shadows as the sun went down. I don't know why, but they frightened me so. All that black had no light, only fright. No one held my hand. And so too from the women with their formerly warm, nurturing bosoms, now turned paper white and cold. Hiding themselves from other men, they lived in the shadows in that home in which I never felt at home. I suppose they were there busily covering their hair. Caring for the children was their prayer, somewhere in the darkness of that home. No one held my hand. Once in a while, carefully disguised as curious shoppers, my parents visited their old neighborhood. I followed a few paces behind to distance myself from their German accents, so unwelcomed in this new land. No one held my hand. I can still smell a freshly baked, crusty rye bread with Kimmel and the unmistakable odor of the still warm dead chicken after its white feathers flew swirling in the air, and then finally my heart stopped racing. I recall putting my unwashed hand in a huge wooden brine-filled barrel with kosher dills. After so many years, I still remember the crinkling noise of the paper they wrapped it in. Long before I could walk, my parents ran away and stayed away from home forever after. They died in silence, still far from home, the words of the Kaddish forever unspoken. And as for me, I still stumble on the steps of my synagogue. I hesitate to open the door to all my unfulfilled prayers. I tell my grief in a gentle voice, this is the ancient home of my parents' parents and their parents. Come and sit. Just visit for a while. Maybe I can ask someone to hold my hand. So if you're not Jewish, there are a lot of references here to things that you may not understand. The reference to to leaving behind our brothers and fathers who wore long black suits and beards and strange hats really was the Hasidic Orthodox Jews. And yeah, it's too long a story for me to go into now. And also for the women and their the metaphors here around feeling like one doesn't belong, not in one's own family, not in one's own sort of home and ancestral line, and running away and leaving, and the trying to adapt to a new culture. And so it's a very personal thing, but I
Peter, thank you.
moved to read it.
Thank you. Very moving. And indeed, that is a part of how we think about all of our ancestry, is trying to figure out how we relate to them and have, in many cases, our thoughts dominated by what moved them to do what they did. Okay, that's it for the summer. I will take under advisement the idea of a quarterly meeting. I may have us move into a slightly smaller room. I don't know that we need to take up the East Rec, as long as we have a good Zoom connection, since we always seem to have a substantial number of people from Zoom. Okay, thank you all.